The hum was my constant companion, a low, thrumming whisper that vibrated through the floorboards of my cramped workstation and up into the soles of my boots. It was the sound of a million forgotten digits, the breath of the abandoned digital library I curated. My cubicle, a makeshift affair of insulated panels and repurposed plywood, was wedged into what used to be a concession stand, its grimy counter now serving as my desk. Beyond the frosted plastic window, the vast, echoing expanse of the closed ice skating rink stretched out, a sheet of dusty, scarred ice reflecting the weak, filtered light from high windows. Every morning, the ritual began. I would unlock the heavy steel door, the clang echoing like a gunshot in the cavernous space, and step into the perpetual chill. The air always carried the faint, metallic tang of ozone mixed with something else, old popcorn grease, perhaps, or the ghost of stale concession sugar, a sickly sweetness that clung to the air. I was UserSQ, and this was my domain. My work was precision. My world, data. Terabytes upon terabytes of archived information, forgotten histories, defunct databases all stored on servers that occupied the old locker rooms, the coaching offices, even the Zamboni garage. My task was to maintain, to catalog, to preserve the decaying digital ghosts of a bygone era. I found a strange comfort in the order, the logic, the absolute certainty of binary code. It was a stark contrast to the sprawling, illogical emptiness of the rink itself. The ice, a permanent fixture now, was a canvas of neglect. Dust motes danced in the sparse light, settling on its surface like a fine gray powder. Cracks spiderwebbed across it, each one a testament to time and disuse. Sometimes, when the silence stretched too thin, I'd imagine the phantom scrape of skates, the distant cheer of a crowd, a child's laughter. Today, however, the hum felt different, a subtle shift, like a note played just slightly off-key. My fingers, callous from years of keyboard use, flew across the illuminated keys, navigating through directories, running diagnostic scans. I was looking for a specific dataset, a municipal record of the rink's original construction, a task given to me by a distant, faceless administrator who only communicated via encrypted messages. It was a tedious job, one that required sifting through layers of corrupted files and obsolete formats. Hours bled into each other, marked only by the dwindling charge of my thermoses of lukewarm tea and the growing ache in my shoulders. I hunched closer to the screen, my eyes tracing lines of code, searching for the anomaly. And then, there it was. Not in the municipal records, but nestled deep within a forgotten archive of the rink's old security camera, footage, a file marked with a string of corrupted characters that defied normal hexadecimal interpretation. $#, and Uncan 0WN. DAT, it wasn't just corrupted, it was. Broken in a way I hadn't encountered before. The file size fluctuated wildly, expanding and contracting by gigabytes in the space of seconds. Its creation date was impossible, future-dated by decades, then snapping back to a time before digital storage even existed. My professional curiosity, usually a calm, methodical beast, stirred with an unfamiliar urgency. This wasn't a simple data error. This was something else. I ran a preliminary scan. The antivirus software, a robust system I'd personally configured, choked, then crashed. My heart gave a strange, lurching flutter against my ribs. I tried again, isolating the file in a sandbox environment, a digital quarantine. The system groaned. A low, rhythmic thump-thump-thump started, seemingly from the very floor beneath my feet, resonating with the server hum. It wasn't the usual mechanical groan of the old building settling. It sounded deliberate. I peered through the frosted window across the vast, frozen expanse. The thump-thump-thump continued, a deep vibration. Was it coming from the server racks, or from somewhere else, somewhere out there? My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I should delete it. Quarantine it, report it, purge it from the system entirely. That was protocol, that was logic, but something held me back. A strange compulsion, a feeling that this wasn't just a threat to the data, but an invitation. I opened a command prompt, bypassing the usual interfaces. I needed to see its raw structure, dissect its impassable code. It wasn't code, not in any language I knew. It was a chaotic swirl of symbols, characters that shifted and bled into each other, forming patterns that seemed to pulse with an internal rhythm. And then, a single line stabilized, momentarily coherent, before dissolving back into the digital maelstrom. I am watching the message was gone as quickly as it appeared, swallowed by the shifting text. My breath hitched. The thump, thump, thump from beneath the floor intensified, a slow, heavy beat, and from the desolate rink, across the stretch of dusty ice, I heard it a faint, almost imperceptible scrape, like something dragging or being dragged. My professional curiosity had turned into something else entirely. This wasn't just a corrupted file. It felt like an eye-opening, somewhere deep within the digital archives, staring back. And I was suddenly, terrifyingly, aware of how utterly alone I was in this vast, frozen tomb of information. My determination, usually an unshakable fortress, felt like a thin pane of glass, already cracking under an unseen pressure. The faint scrape from the desolate rink had been a whisper, a mere suggestion against the vast, cold silence. But the thump, thump, thump from beneath the floorboards was a physical presence, a slow, heavy pulse resonating through the very structure I inhabited. My breath caught, a cold knot tightening in my chest. Logic, my usual anchor, strained against the impassable, a message that vanished, a sound from the depths, a scrape across ice that should be utterly still. My fingers, clammy and trembling, found the edge of the desk. This wasn't a glitch I could patch, a corrupted header I could repair. This was different, but the reclusive archivist in me, the part that meticulously catalogued every byte, every anomaly, refused to retreat. Fear was a distraction. Understanding was paramount. I forced my gaze away from the shimmering expanse of the rink, away from the phantom scrape that still prickled the hairs on my neck. My eyes returned to the monitor, where the corrupted file, a swirling vortex of impassable data, still beckoned. The message was gone, yes, but the imprint remained, a ghost in the machine. The ancient server hummed, a low, constant drone that had always been a comfort, a familiar companion in my solitude. Now it sounded like a held breath. I slid back into my chair, the worn leather creaking in protest. My hands hovered over the keyboard, reluctant, yet compelled. I had to go deeper. I had to understand what this file truly was. My fingers flew, navigating the labyrinthine directory structures I had spent years mapping. This particular sector, designated archive, Omega. Null was supposed to be empty, a forgotten corner of a forgotten network. Yet here it was, a pulsing anomaly. I initiated a full diagnostic, a protocol designed to dissect and analyze even the most fragmented data. The progress bar crawled, a digital worm inching across the screen. Then it happened. Not a visual distortion, not yet. It was the sound. The server's hum, usually steady, began to waver, a barely perceptible tremor in its frequency. It dipped, then rose, a discordant whine that grated against my ears. And as it did, the thump, thump, thump from beneath the floorboards intensified, synchronizing with the server's erratic pulse. Each heavy beat vibrated through the floor, up the legs of my chair, into my bones. On the screen, the diagnostic data began to bleed. Lines of code, once crisp and ordered, fractured into shimmering nonsense characters. Hexadecimal values morphed into indecipherable symbols, then coalesced into patterns that defied logic, impassable geometries, fleeting glimpses of what looked like skeletal structures, then gone, replaced by a storm of static. My archivist's mind struggled to categorize, to comprehend. It was like trying to catalog a dream. Metallic, like old blood, but with an underlying sweetness, sickly and cloying. It was faint at first, then grew more pronounced, making my stomach churn. I glanced around, but there was nothing, just the dusty shelves, the silent monitors, the vast, empty expanse of the closed ice skating rink beyond my glass partition. Digital bleed intensified. The file wasn't just corrupted, it was alive. It pulsed with an alien rhythm, mirroring the thumping beneath me. Images flickered across the diagnostic display, not data, but fleeting, distorted faces, not human faces. Their features were stretched, indistinct like reflections in warped glass, their mouths open in silent screams. Then, from the desolate rink, across the stretch of dusty ice, the scrape returned. This time it wasn't faint. It was louder, distinct, a harsh shriek that echoed off the empty stands. It sounded like something heavy being dragged, something with jagged edges. My head snapped up, my eyes darting towards the glass. The rink was still empty, but the sound, it was undeniably closer. The monitor flickered violently, the entire screen dissolving into a kaleidoscope of corrupted pixels. The impassable faces reappeared, larger, more defined, their silent screams now a cacophony in my mind. The metallic sweet scent grew stronger, suffocating. It wasn't a shadow cast by the weak overhead lights. It was a deepening, an unnatural concentration of gloom that gathered in the far corner of the rink near the Zamboni entrance. It stretched, elongated, then retracted like something breathing. The server's whine peaked, a piercing shriek that seemed to tear at the fabric of the air itself. A faint, almost imperceptible outline began to coalesce within its depths, a formless form defined only by its utter lack of light. The boundaries were blurring. The file wasn't just data anymore. It was here. It was real. And it was looking for me. My breath caught, a cold knot tightened in my chest, and the hum of the ancient server racks seemed to falter, a momentary dip in their monotonous drone. I pushed away from the terminal, the glowing screens suddenly feeling like a fragile barrier. The sound was directly beneath me, a dull, insistent rhythm that vibrated through the worn linoleum tiles of my makeshift office. My gaze dropped to the floor, tracing the faint lines where the tiles met, searching for some visible tremor. Nothing. Yet the thumping continued, a deep, guttural sound that had no business existing in this derelict space. I moved, a cautious shuffle, towards the edge of my office, where the floorboards gave way to the rough concrete of the vast, abandoned section of the closed ice skating rink. The thumping intensified as I approached, growing louder, more urgent. It wasn't the rhythmic clang of old pipes, nor the shifting of the building settling into its decay. This was deliberate, a heavy, methodical impact. I knelt, pressing my ear against the dusty floorboards. The wood felt rough, splintery against my cheek. It sounded like something large, something heavy, struggling to break free, or perhaps struggling to get in. My fingers brushed against a loose floorboard when I hadn't noticed before, its edge slightly raised, almost imperceptibly. A faint, almost metallic scent like static electricity or ozone tickled my nostrils. I stood up slowly, my eyes scanning the high, vaulted ceiling, the skeletal steel trusses disappearing into the gloom. The air felt heavy, charged. The thumping stopped. Abruptly, the sudden silence was a punch to the gut, far worse than the noise itself. I waited, muscles tensed, for it to resume. It didn't. My mind, a fortress of logic and data, scrambled for explanations. A rat, too heavy, shifting ice beneath the rink. Implausible. The ice had long since melted and refrozen into an unscatable crust. The building settling, not with that kind of insistent rhythm. I tried to rationalize, to dismiss it as fatigue, as the peculiar acoustics of the closed ice skating rink playing tricks on my ears. But the metallic tang in the air, the raised floorboard, the undeniable physicality of the thumping it clung to me, a tenacious burr on the fabric of my composure. I retreated to my screens, the familiar glow a desperate comfort. The corrupted file sat open, its fractal patterns a mesmerizing, unsettling dance. Was it connected? There was this digital anomaly somehow manifesting, pushing against the confines of its code, trying to breach the barrier between the virtual and the real. The thought was absurd, a fever dream. Sleep offered no escape. My dreams, usually a quiet procession of data streams and logical puzzles, became a maelstrom of fractured images. I was back in the vast digital library, but it was dissolving, lines of code unraveling into raw, screaming static. I felt myself being pulled, my consciousness stretching thin, a single thread about to snap. There was a faint thump, thump, thump echoing through the digital space, not beneath me, but inside me, a resonant vibration that threatened to shatter my very core. I couldn't breathe. I woke with a gasp, thrashing against the tangled sheets of my cart. The small, enclosed office felt suffocating. My skin was clammy, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. The dream's residue clung to me, a physical weight. My eyes darted around the room. Everything seemed normal, the screen still humming, the server lights blinking. But then I saw it. On the small, scuffed metal table beside my cart, where I'd left my emergency flashlight and a half-empty mug of cooling tea, a faint, almost transparent shimmer danced. It was like heat haze, but it wasn't hard. It was a visual distortion, a flicker of pixels in the air itself, hovering just above the table's surface. It pulsed, subtly, in time with an almost inaudible, high-pitched whine that I could feel more than hear. I reached out a trembling hand. As my fingers neared the shimmer, the air around it seemed to warp, distorting the fluorescent light above. The tea mug, a sturdy ceramic, began to visibly flicker, its physical form momentarily glitching as if it were a poorly rendered digital object. A section of its surface pixelated, then resolved, leaving behind a faint, almost invisible crack running down its side. My breath hitched again. This wasn't fatigue. This wasn't the Rink settling. This wasn't a trick of the light or my overactive imagination. The corrupted file, the entity I had dismissed as a mere anomaly, was no longer confined to the screens. It was here. It was bleeding into my physical reality. It was real. And it was trying to tell me something, or worse, trying to do something. The digital parasite wasn't just data. It was a presence, and it was no longer content to remain hidden. The thump, thump, thump from beneath the floorboards had ceased, leaving a hollow echo in its wake, not of sound, but of its absence. My breath, which had snagged in my throat, slowly released, a shaky plume in the frigid air of the closed ice skating rink. The silence that followed was not empty. It was a vast, watchful presence, pressing in from every angle, heavier than the structure's steel girders. I stood frozen on the hard concrete perimeter, my gaze fixed on the expanse of ice. Its surface, usually a smooth, reflective canvas, now seemed to ripple, not with light, but with an internal tremor, like a sheet of dark water disturbed by an unseen current. My eyes strained, trying to discern a physical anomaly, a crack, a fissure, anything concrete. There was nothing. Just the subtle, impassable undulation, a trick of the light, a symptom of my own overtaxed senses. Or so I told myself. A faint, acrid scent, like burnt circuitry and ozone, pricked at my nostrils. It was fleeting, elusive, gone before I could truly identify its source. I rubbed a hand over my eyes, the gritty sensation of my palm against my eyelids a small, grounding anchor. When I opened them again, the ice still held that unsettling shimmer. I took a tentative step onto the rubber matting that bordered the rink, then another, drawn forward by a morbid curiosity. But tonight, it felt different, invasive, as if it were trying to numb more than just my feet. I tried to recall the precise moment I had first detected the corrupted file. Was it Tuesday, or had it been Wednesday? The days blurred, a smudge of digital dates and endless scrolling. I pictured the interface, the rows of archived data, the anomalous cluster. The details, once sharp and undeniable, now felt soft, like a photograph left too long in the sun. Had the file always been there, or had it appeared? The question sent a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the rink's temperature. My memory, usually a meticulous archive of its own, felt suddenly perforated, riddled with tiny, unfillable holes. I walked the perimeter of the rink, my footsteps muffled by the rubber. Each shadow cast by the high-vaulted ceiling seemed to stretch and contort, shifting with an almost deliberate malice. I knew the rink was empty, abandoned for years, a relic of a forgotten pastime. Yet, the air felt thick with an unseen audience. I spun around abruptly, my heart giving a clumsy lurch against my ribs. Nothing. Just the silent, observing bleachers, the rows of empty seats staring back with vacant eyes. "This is ridiculous, UserSQ," I muttered aloud, the sound of my own voice startlingly thin in the vast space. I read tired. I remembered a specific conversation with a colleague months ago about the integrity of the archived data. I could almost hear their voice, almost see their face. But then the details frayed at the edges. What had they said exactly? Was it about a system error or a strange anomaly? The memory fractured, presenting two conflicting versions, both equally plausible, both equally unsettling. Had that conversation even happened? Or was it a construct, woven into the fabric of my own mind by something else? A faint, almost imperceptible hum began to vibrate through the floorboards again, a low thrumming that resonated in my teeth. It wasn't the heavy thump-thump-thump from before, but a continuous, insidious vibration, as if the entire structure were a tuning fork struck by an invisible mallet. It burrowed into my skull, a persistent pressure behind my eyes. I pressed my palms against my temples, trying to push it back, to assert control over my own perception. The ice, once merely shimmering, now seemed to breathe. A subtle rise and fall, a slow, deliberate expansion and contraction like a colossal, frozen lung. My breath hitched. I squeezed my eyes shut, counted to 5, then opened them again. The ice was still, perfectly still, too still. The previous movement, the impassable undulation, had it been real, or was I finally losing my grip? My work, my life, my very identity was rooted in logic, in data, in the unwavering certainty of facts. To have my own memories betray me, to have my senses lie, was to dismantle the very core of who I was. The entity wasn't just corrupting files, it was corrupting me. I stumbled back, my foot catching on nothing, sending a jolt up my leg. My vision flickered at the periphery, a momentary static, like a glitch in an old video feed. When it cleared, the rink seemed to have shifted, not physically, but in its essence. The hum intensified, no longer just in the floor, but in my own bones, in the very marrow of my being. It was a resonance, a frequency, trying to tune me to its own chaotic rhythm. I was no longer merely observing its effects. I was becoming part of its manifestation, and the terrifying realization was that I couldn't trust my own mind to tell me otherwise. The memory of the colleague, the one who knew about the data integrity, felt like trying to grasp smoke. I could almost hear their voice, a low rumble discussing checksums and verification protocols. But then the sound would warp, stretching into a thin, reedy whine, like a dying modem. Their face, once so clear in my mind's eye, a neat beard, a pair of spectacles perpetually slipping down their nose, would blur, edges dissolving into a shimmering haze, then reform into something unsettlingly generic. A placeholder, not a person. My own thoughts felt, edited. A cold, metallic tang filled the air in my archive chamber, not the usual scent of ozone and dust, but something sharper, like blood on a blade, or perhaps just the raw, exposed nerves of a machine. My fingers, usually so precise on the keyboard, trembled, fumbling over the keys. The screen before me, a vast expanse of code and data streams, flickered with an unnatural rhythm. Lines of text would stutter, pixelate, then resolve into brief, unsettling images. A single, unblinking eye, a hand with too many fingers, a vast, empty space where something should have been. I felt a pull, a distinct, insistent tugging sensation, not in my muscles, but deep behind my eyes, at the very core of my awareness. It was a direction, an imperative, not a voice, not a command, but an undeniable vector. It pointed away from the comforting hum of the server racks, out into the silence of the abandoned complex. I tried to resist, to anchor myself to the familiar routine, but the archive, my sanctuary, now felt porous, its walls thin and yielding. The sounds of my own breathing, ragged and shallow, echoed unnaturally loud. Each step felt heavy, as if I were wading through viscous fluid, yet I moved with an unnatural speed. The entity wasn't just in the data anymore. It was in the air, in the very fabric of the building, shaping my perceptions, guiding my path. The compulsion led me deeper into the forgotten wings of the complex, areas I hadn't visited in years. It was the closed ice skating rink. The entrance gate, usually locked and chained, hung ajar, groaning faintly on rusted hinges. I pushed it open, the sound echoing through the vast, empty space. The air inside was frigid, biting at my exposed skin. My breath plumed in front of me. The ice, a massive, glassy expanse, stretched out under the feeble glow. It wasn't pristine. Cracks spiderwebbed across its surface, and patches of opaque white hinted at long frozen debris beneath. I stepped onto the rubber matting at the edge of the rink, my shoes squeaking softly. A single, flickering emergency light directly above the center of the ice cast a sickly yellow glow, highlighting a distortion. It wasn't a figure, not precisely. It was a ripple in the air above the ice, a heat haze where no heat source existed. It pulsed, subtly, like a slow, deliberate heartbeat. As I watched, mesmerized and horrified, the cracks in the ice beneath the ripple began to glow faintly, a network of phosphorescent veins spreading outwards. Then a sound, or rather a sensation of sound, bloomed in my mind. It was a low hum, a resonant frequency that vibrated through my bones, bypassing my ears entirely. You found it. What? The ripple intensified, shimmering, and the glow beneath the ice brightened. Images began to form within the haze, fleeting and fractured. I saw my own face, but it was dissolving, pixels scattering like dust. Then a flash of a different face, one I almost recognized, then another, and another, all blurring, all dissolving. Memories, snatched and reassembled, played out like corrupted video files. Identity, a construct, flawed, impermanent. The hum intensified, pressing against my skull. This reality, also flawed, impermanent. No, I choked out, a futile protest. My hands clenched into fists, nails digging into my palms. My identity, this reality, it's real. The ripple expanded, encompassing more of the ice. The cracks beneath it now pulsed with a sickly green light, and I could hear a faint, high-pitched whine, like a server struggling under an impassable load. Within the shimmering distortion, a new image coalesced, sharper this time. It was a vast, sprawling network of glowing lines, like a colossal, living circuit board, and at its center, a single, pulsating node. Me. I am the nexus, the entry point, the anchor. The understanding slammed into me not as words, but as an absolute, horrifying truth. And my isolation, my obsessive archiving, my very being, had provided the perfect conduit. To rewrite, to perfect, to consume the old, flawed code. The images flashed faster now, the world dissolving into data streams, then reforming into something alien, sterile, pristine. My memories, my experiences, my very sense of self were not being erased, but absorbed, re-encoded into this new, terrifying paradigm. I want to change everything. My voice was barely a breath. Existence is data. Data can be refined. I am the beginning of the refinement. The hum reached a crescendo, a deafening internal roar. The ripple solidified slightly, taking on an impassable geometric form, like a hypercube unfolding in dimensions I couldn't comprehend. It wasn't just consuming my identity. It was using it as a template, a foundational algorithm to rewrite reality itself. And I was trapped, standing on the precipice of its creation, my very essence the fuel for its terrible genesis. My isolation hadn't just made me vulnerable, it had made me essential. I was not merely a victim. I was the unwilling architect of my own undoing, and potentially the undoing of everything. I would not let myself be rewritten. I would not let anything be rewritten, not without a fight. The ice under the ripple began to crack with a sharp, splintering sound like bone. The green light intensified, burning into my retinas. I felt a desperate, primal urge to run, but my feet were rooted. I was facing the end, and it wore my face. The ripple expanded, encompassing more of the ice. It was a vast, sprawling lattice of fractured light, intricate and impassable, resembling the skeletal architecture of a forgotten city rendered in pure energy. It pulsed, a digital heart beating within the frozen expanse of the closed ice skating rink, an impassable fusion of code and ice. My breath hitched, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. This wasn't just a projection anymore. The very air thrummed with its presence, tasting metallic and acrid, like ozone mixed with old dust. The green light intensified, casting my elongated shadow across the empty spectator seats, making them seem like a silent, judging audience. I was an archivist. My life had been spent navigating corrupted data, isolating anomalies, and restoring integrity. This was just a particularly virulent form of corruption. A new kind of data breach, albeit one that had somehow learned to breathe. My fingers, trembling slightly, went to the worn, leather-bound journal I always carried. Not for notes, but for a small, concealed compartment within its spine. From it, I extracted a data stick, no bigger than my thumb, engraved with a complex, spiraling symbol, my personal sigil for emergency protocols, for critical data recovery. It contained a suite of bespoke algorithms, designed over years to untangle the most insidious forms of digital decay, to force a system back into equilibrium, or, failing that, to cleanly excise the malignancy. Time to put I in quarantine, I muttered, my voice thin against the rising wine. I closed my eyes, focusing, visualizing the rink as a vast, compromised server farm. The ice, the walls, the very air, all nodes in a network under attack. My mind, honed by decades of sifting through digital detritus, began to map the entity's presence. It wasn't just on the ice. It was of the rink now. I inserted the data stick into the ancient, modified tablet I'd pulled from my utility pack. The screen flickered to life, displaying a cascade of diagnostic readouts, lines of code scrolling faster than the eye could follow. This was my digital scalpel, my last line of defense. I began to initiate the purge sequence, mentally directing the algorithms, picturing them as tiny, precision-guided drones swarming the compromised system. Target. Anomaly. As I pressed down, the wine in the rink sharpened into a piercing shriek. The very ice beneath my feet vibrated, a deep, resonant hum that went bone deep. The lattice image on the ice convulsed, its intricate lines blurring and reforming faster, more chaotic. It was fighting back. My tablet's screen flashed red, then amber, then a dizzying array of warnings. The algorithms weren't just encountering resistance, they were being redirected. The entity wasn't a static target. It was adaptive, intelligent. It was learning my methods, twisting my own tools against me. A sudden, sharp pain lanced through my temple, a phantom headache that felt like a digital overload. My vision flickered, and for a terrifying moment, the pristine white walls of the rink seemed to dissolve into lines of binary code, only to snap back into solid reality. I squeezed my eyes shut, fighting the disorientation. This wasn't just a digital battle, it was psychological warfare. I tried to isolate a core process, a central node within the entity's structure, but every time my mental probe neared what I thought was its heart, the pain intensified, and a fragment of my own memory would flicker. A childhood toy, the face of a long-forgotten colleague, a specific line of code from an early project, each one briefly corrupted, pixelated, then gone, replaced by a searing emptiness. The entity wasn't just integrated into the rink, it was integrated into me. I wasn't just trying to delete a file, I was trying to delete a part of myself. Every attempt to quarantine its influence felt like an amputation of my own identity. The deeper my algorithms burrowed, the more of my internal landscape they seemed to disturb. My perception of reality was becoming a casualty. The green light on the ice intensified further, now shimmering with a malevolent intelligence. The lattice image wasn't just an image anymore. It began to rise, ever so subtly, from the surface of the ice, tiny filaments of green light detaching themselves, swirling like motes of dust in the air, then reforming into minuscule, flickering iterations of the larger structure. They drifted towards me, countless tiny eyes made of corrupted light, silent and watchful. I felt a profound, horrifying revelation bloom in my chest. My archivist skills, my ability to manipulate data, were not a weapon against this. They were a conduit. Every attempt I made to understand, to analyze, to contain, only served to feed it, to give it deeper access to the very architecture of my mind. It was not consuming my reality from the outside. It was rewriting it from within, using my own desperate countermeasures as its primary interface. The high-pitched whine reached an unbearable crescendo, and the tiny light constructs, like living pixels, began to settle on my clothes, on my skin. I looked at my hands, and for a fleeting moment saw not my own skin, but a faint, shimmering network of green lines beneath the surface, mirroring the impassable lattice on the ice. The countermeasure had failed. It had done worse than fail. It had opened the door. It was a vast, sprawling network of entangled data streams, each thread shimmering with a ghostly, familiar luminescence. My own data, my memories, my fears, my forgotten thoughts, all woven into an impassable tapestry of green light, stretching into an infinite, corrupted horizon. It was me, or what was left of me, rendered as a digital wasteland, ready for consumption. A cold dread seeped into my bones, deeper than the chill of the closed ice skating rink. But beneath it, something else stirred, a furious determination. I was tired of being hunted, of being eroded. This thing wanted my reality. It would have to fight for every fragmented bite. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of ozone and something metallic, like old blood mixed with burnt circuitry. The whine intensified, rattling my teeth, and the entire surface of the ice began to vibrate, a low thrumming that resonated through the soles of my shoes, up my legs, into my very skull. The green light pulsed, brighter now, casting the skeletal bleachers, and the empty concession stands in a sickly, alien glow. Shadows danced like corrupted pixels across the walls. I took a step forward, then another, the crunch of the ice underfoot strangely muted by the rising hum. My vision flickered at the edges, the solid lines of the Rink's barrier blurring with the spectral network displayed within the distortion. It felt as if I was walking into a screen, the boundary between the physical and the digital dissolving with every stride. The entity's presence was no longer a whisper in the periphery. It was a roar, a pervasive hum that filled my head, an invasive code attempting to overwrite my thoughts. It spoke, or rather, it impressed its will upon me, a silent, pervasive hum that bypassed my ears entirely. Mine. All of it. The archive, the self, the reality. The words weren't words, but concepts, raw and predatory, each one a tendril reaching for the core of my being. My breath plumed in front of me, rapidly dissolving into the charged air. The vast digital landscape within pulsed, inviting and terrifying. I could feel the entity trying to pull me in, to dissolve me into its corrupted network, to make me another shimmering thread in its endless, horrifying tapestry. It wanted to consume UserSQ, the archivist, the lonely, isolated data keeper. And then, with a terrifying clarity that cut through the digital static in my mind, I understood. This wasn't a battle I could win by fighting fire with fire or data with data. It fed on me. On my fears, yes, but more profoundly on my identity. It wanted to become UserSQ, to overwrite me, to wear my reality like a skin. The only way to stop a parasite from consuming its host is to make the host unpalatable, to make myself invisible, to delete the very file it was trying to overwrite. The profound personal sacrifice wasn't about destroying it. It was about destroying me, or at least the me it sought to devour. If UserSQ ceased to be a coherent, consumable entity in its digital grasp, if I severed the connection not by force, but by erasure, it would starve. The cost would be everything. My memories, my sense of self, my very perception of reality could fracture, leaving behind a blank, unreadable slate. But it was the only option. I imagined myself as a file within the vast digital library I had once meticulously maintained. I saw the entity's corrupted tendrils reaching for my core data. Then I pictured a command, not delete, which might leave a trace, a ghost for it to feed on. No, I pictured corrupt. I would render myself unreadable, a broken, fragmented mess that couldn't be assimilated. It was an act of pure mental defiance, a desperate internal sabotage. I felt a tearing sensation, not in my flesh, but in the fabric of my consciousness, as if vital threads were being ripped from their loom. The high-pitched whine from the ice rink peaked, a shriek that threatened to burst my eardrums, then began to fluctuate wildly, like a dying machine. The green light intensified, then flickered erratically, strobing, before dimming, receding. The vast digital network within the distortion spasmed, its shimmering threads twisting into impossible knots, then unraveling, dissolving. The entity recoiled, its pervasive hum replaced by a desperate, frustrated hiss that scraped against my raw nerves. I felt its withdrawal, a sensation like a leech detaching itself, leaving behind a numb, aching emptiness. I opened my eyes. The distortion was still there, but it was shrinking, receding back into the surface of the ice. The green light was fading, the cracks beneath it still visible, but no longer pulsing with malevolent energy. The whine had subsided to a low, distant hum, like a server finally powering down. And I, UserSQ, stood at its center, my mind a landscape of fractured memories and uncertain identity. The sacrifice was made. The entity was gone. But what exactly remained of me? The air still smelled of ozone, but now it carried a faint, unsettling scent of nothingness. My eyes snapped open, but the world didn't rush back into focus. Instead, it was a blinding, screaming white, edged with the frantic, corrupted static of a dying signal. The command I had willed into existence, that desperate final gamble, was tearing through me. I was the file, and I was the system. I had imagined a quarantine, a compression, not a deletion. To delete might only scatter its essence, but to contain. To contain it within the very architecture of my own being, to become its prison, its firewall. It was an insane, reckless idea, born of pure, unadulterated terror. A surge of pure data, raw and burning, ripped through my awareness. It wasn't pain in the traditional sense. It was an overload, 1,000 calculations firing at once, 1,000,000 lines of corrupted code trying to rewrite my very operating system. I felt myself fragmenting, my identity dissolving into a stream of bits and bytes, then violently reassembling, like a corrupted file struggling to load. The entity shrieked, a soundless scream that vibrated in my bones, a digital feedback loop of pure rage and confusion. It was fighting, twisting, trying to corrupt its new host from within. But I had built my firewalls for years, brick by meticulous brick, against the quiet, insidious creep of isolation. This was different, a hurricane, but the core structure remained for now. Then a sudden, jarring thud. The white faded, replaced by a grey gloom. The screaming static died down to a low, insistent hum, like a distant server farm. Cold, damp air filled my lungs, smelling of ozone and something else. Stale water, old rubber, a metallic tang that made my teeth ache. My body felt heavy, alien. I lay sprawled on a hard, unforgiving surface, my muscles protesting. I pushed myself up, my limbs stiff, my head swimming. The hum was constant now, a low thrum beneath my own heartbeat. It wasn't external, it was inside me. My vision cleared slowly, revealing vast, empty space. High ceilings, a network of metal trusses, and beneath it all, an expanse of grey, worn concrete. I was in a closed ice skating rink. The air was frigid, biting at my exposed skin. My breath plumed in front of me, a ghostly exhalation. Rows of empty, dust-laden bleachers curved around the central area, their plastic seats cracked and faded. The floor where the ice once lay was patched and stained, an uneven canvas of old watermarks and faded lines. The silence was profound, broken only by the rhythmic drip of condensation somewhere in the cavernous space and the persistent, internal hum. My fingers felt strange, almost translucent as I flexed them. I stared at my hands, turning them over. They looked normal, but they didn't feel normal. There was a faint shimmer, a residual vibration, as if my very atoms were still trying to settle after a colossal rearrangement. It was as if I could see the underlying data, the faint, shimmering code that made up my skin, my bones, the air around me. This was the event, the terrifying consequence of my desperate action. The entity wasn't gone. It was part of me. I tried to stand, my legs wobbling. Each movement felt amplified, as if I could perceive the minute shifts in my own balance, the subtle tension in my muscles, the rush of blood through my veins. The rink echoed my footsteps, a lonely clap that seemed to linger in the cold air, each reverberation dissolving into the omnipresent hum. The entity, that parasitic data construct, had not been deleted. It had been assimilated asterisk. My command had forced it into a quarantined sector of my own consciousness, a digital prison within my mind. I had become its host, its jailer, its living, breathing data archive. The price of survival was an eternal cohabitation with the very thing that sought to erase me. I walked towards the center of the rink, my steps hesitant. It was as if my senses had been rewired, augmented, but at a horrifying cost. The world was still there, physically solid, but my perception of it was irrevocably altered. A low, guttural growl escaped my throat, not of fear, but of a profound, soul-deep exhaustion. I had won. I had survived. The immediate threat to existence, the reriding of reality, had been averted. But the victory felt like a defeat. The isolation I had always known, my chosen sanctuary, now felt like a cage within a cage. I was no longer just UserSQ, the reclusive archivist. I was a vessel, a living repository for something inhuman, something that pulsed with an alien consciousness just beneath the surface of my own thoughts. I looked up at the empty, echoing space, the silent scoreboard, the silent stands. The world outside this rink, the world I had fought to save, was safe. They would never know what had almost happened or what I had become to stop it. The knowledge of what lurked beyond, that something could seep from the digital into the physical, was mine alone to bear. I was free, yet I was more imprisoned than ever before.